HighBridge, a division of Recorded Books, presents Taxing Wars, The American Way of War Finance and the Decline of Democracy by Sarah Kreps. Read by Lisa Flanagan. 1. Introduction. In the days after the attacks of September 11, 2001, President George W. Bush famously stood in New York City in the rubble of the destroyed World Trade Centers, held a bullhorn and said, "I can hear you. The rest of the world hears you, and the people who knocked these buildings down will hear all of us soon." In the days that followed, he also urged Americans to get down to Disney World in Florida. Take your families and enjoy life, the way we want it to be enjoyed. Americans, he urged, should not hunker down and make gestures of sacrifice, but return to normalcy. Consistent with this tone, the government cut taxes, and efforts to introduce a share-the-sacrifice war tax to pay for military action in Iraq in 2007 and Afghanistan in 2009 in response to the attacks were restricted to political theater of renegade anti-war members of Congress. Responding to these war tax proposals, Representative Jerry Lewis, Republican, California, said that Americans were already being taxed to death and would be hostile toward any type of new tax, including a war tax. Democrats themselves ran away from this idea as fast as you can say the words Republican majority. The result is that the government has financed the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan entirely through borrowing. Financing these recent wars through debt could not have been more different from earlier experiences when wars meant taxation. In 1914, 3 years before America's direct involvement in World War I, President Wilson urged war taxes as a way to fund defense preparations. Borrowing money is short-sighted finance. We should pay as we go. The industry of this generation should pay the bills of this generation. Despite trying to gain the American people's acquiescence to enter the war and later to maintain their support throughout the war, the Wilson administration levied a series of war taxes before, during, and after the war, amounting to about 1/3 of the war's costs. The public was no less deterred from the war or war taxes at that time than they had been in the Spanish-American War, when editorials proclaimed that the populace would cheerfully pay the cost in war taxes. Why, when Wilson was aiming to recruit support for the war from a reluctant public, did he introduce measures such as a hefty war tax that recent leaders have considered politically toxic? Why was the public so magnanimous in its willingness to contribute its own resources? By contrast, why did recent leaders not use the crisis of war, often employed as the entree for introducing war taxes, in the aftermath of 9/11 to extract resources from the populace in a way that had been customary in the past? More generally, what explains shifting attitudes toward bearing the financial burden of war, moving away from war taxes, and the consequences of that shift? In this book, I argue that the starkly different approaches are the result of public attitudes toward wartime fiscal sacrifice that vary depending on the underlying type of war and state-society relations, in particular the role of taxation in the nation's social and political life, discussed in more detail in Chapter 2. As Scarlett O'Hara said in Gone with the Wind, death, taxes, and childbirth, there's never any convenient time for any of them. But there are less inconvenient times than others. That innate antipathy toward the inconvenience of taxation can be dislodged by certain types of wars and state-society relations. When these factors combine to make the public cost sensitive, leaders have pursued forms of war finance that anticipate opposition and minimize constraints on the way they use force. In the post-1945 world, the public has become almost uniformly unforgiving of fiscal sacrifice, which explains leaders' increased tendency to rely on less visible forms of finance, such as borrowing. Leaders have, in turn, increasingly operated without the decision-making constraints that were in play in many earlier wars, when individuals were more directly involved in the costs of war. It is no surprise that American wars, since that shift in the latter half of the 20th century, have become increasingly costly and protracted, an observable implication of the unraveling link in accountability between legislators' decision-making and the public's financial burden that democratic theorists have long believed distinguishes democracies from non-democracies when it comes to the conduct of war. War finance and democratic accountability. The direct connection between the populace and the burdens of war underlies many of the theoretical checks and balances thought to characterize democratic restraint in conflict. Immanuel Kant suggested that, if the consent of the citizens is required in order to decide that war should be declared, and in this Constitution it cannot but be the case, nothing is more natural than that they would be very cautious in commencing such a poor game, decreeing for themselves all the calamities of war. Among the latter would be having to fight, having to pay the costs of war from their own resources. As bearing the costs of war should constrain the public and in turn its leaders, this lies at the heart of institutional arguments associated with the democratic peace. Since the people ultimately pay the price of war in higher taxes and bloodshed, they are more sensitive to the costs, in turn curbing leaders' ambitions in conflict. The statement about the costs of war and the populace is grounded in several assumptions: that the direct, visible costs of war are passed along to the citizenry in a democracy, that bearing the costs of war is generally unpopular and will make the people judicious about the use of force, and that they have electoral recourse and can register their displeasure with a particular policy. For example, if a leader carries out a costly war, at the ballot box. The implication is not that democracies will not engage in war. It is that since individuals bear the burden, they are sensitive to those costs and put pressure on leaders to keep wars short and low cost. Coupled with the electoral checks embedded in a democracy, the costs of war contribute to, as Michael Doyle labeled the Kantian claim, Republican caution, Kant's hesitation in place of monarchical caprice. The cost-sensitive democratic populace will tend to moderate leaders' ambitions in the conduct of war. Such institutional constraints are not a given, however. Democratic leaders have found ways to sidestep or minimize cost-related public opposition that would check their conduct in war. For example, although the public is thought to be averse to casualties, other arguments suggest that people are willing to tolerate high casualties for the prospect of a successful war. Elite discourse, then, can go some way toward mitigating the adverse effects of casualties, emphasizing the prospect of victory, and potentially relaxing some of the checks and balances that were thought to be embedded in democratic institutions. Perhaps more fundamentally, leaders have found ways to minimize the cost in blood altogether. They have eliminated conscription, thus creating far more localized rather than diffuse consequences of casualties. They have turned toward greater reliance on air power and unmanned aerial vehicles, drones, to reduce dramatically the likelihood of casualties suffered by allies. Leaders have also shifted away from a labor-intensive military in favor of a capital-intensive military that is financially costlier but poses a lower risk of casualties. As evidence of this shift, while the Vietnam War incurred over 58,000 fatalities at a financial cost of about $750 billion in 2010 dollars, the combined wars in Iraq and Afghanistan, also roughly a decade in duration, resulted in around 6,000 fatalities, but at a cost of about $1.5 trillion. If democratic accountability mechanisms require individuals to bear the burdens in blood and treasure, shifting the cost from blood to treasure need not affect the theoretical linkages between leaders' conduct in war and the populace. The reason is that taxation, for example, confronts individuals with the financial burden of war more directly than debt. As Charles Tilly argued, taxation constitutes the largest intervention of governments in their subjects' private life. Taxation is onerous, and when citizens bear the burden of war in taxation, this creates tighter institutional linkages between the public and leaders' conduct of war. As taxpayers have more incentives to hold leaders accountable for how the resources are being used. In contrast, borrowing shields the public from the direct costs and insulates leaders from heavy scrutiny. In turn, it undermines the institutional checks and balances that separate a democracy from the caprice of a non-democracy. To the extent that leaders turn to borrowing as a form of war finance rather than taxation, the gap between their actions and public scrutiny, an accountability gap, widens, reducing the decision-making constraints in ways that affect the allocation of domestic resources, as well as initiation and termination of interstate wars. The contemporary shift from taxation. War taxes were once a mainstay of American war finance. As Thomas Paine said back in 1787, war has but one thing certain, and that is to increase taxes. For a long time and during Paine's time, this was a true statement. Taxes featured prominently in every major American war through World War II, as well as many of the minor wars, such as the 1798 Quasi-War and the 1898 Spanish-American War, producing a finance strategy I call Liberty Bond Wars, in which leaders resorted early and often to war taxes as a form of war finance. Liberty bonds, of course, were a way in which the public financed the government's debt and were not a tax. The label I use here draws the spirit of the initiative, asking the public for fiscal sacrifice, rather than the technicality in which the government accrued debt. Contrary to Paine's assertion, since 1945, the United States has increasingly engaged in hide-and-seek wars. Leaders have shied away from asking the populace for fiscal sacrifice, thereby anticipating and sidestepping public constraints on their conduct of war by avoiding war taxes and seeking less obvious forms of war finance, especially borrowing. As Chapter 5 discusses in detail, President Truman introduced 3 war taxes early in the Korean War, 2 in 1950, another in 1951, but was rebuffed later in the war, withdrawing plans for additional war taxes in 1952. Leaders since then have either reluctantly imposed or altogether eschewed war taxes. The last war tax levied in the United States was a Vietnam surtax in 1968, which President Johnson reluctantly endorsed almost 5 decades ago. To put this trend in context, while the costs of recent wars tend to be lower today than many earlier wars, conflicts comparable in size to those of today were once financed through war taxes. For example, in 1798, the United States levied a war tax for tensions with France, the Quasi-War, even though the tensions never actually reached the threshold of a war and defense spending was just 0.83% of GDP. In 1914, the first year of the World War I tax, defense spending was 0.71%, where it roughly remained until 1918, after 3 waves of war tax legislation. In 1940, the year the United States passed 2 sets of war taxes, defense spending was just 1.55% of GDP. Compare these figures with contemporary spending, which has approached 5% for recent wars. In the past, such revenue demands were grounds for war taxation. Today, leaders finance those wars through borrowing. To be sure, major wars produced major taxes, with the largest historical increases in income taxes associated with the largest revenue needs, during the Civil War, World War I, and World War II. But I submit that paying for wars is analogous to what Aaron Friedberg argues about financing defense in general. In terms of simple bookkeeping arithmetic, there is obviously no single solution, but instead, it is therefore a matter of societal choice. It is a political issue rather than, in any sense, a purely economic one. It becomes political since a nation can generate revenues in a number of ways, through borrowing, printing money, or taxing. Which of these it pursues becomes inherently political, a product of interactions between the war and the society in which those choices are made. tax increases that would, and indeed did, lead to revolt during peacetime have sometimes been tolerated during wartime. The increase for acceptance of taxes during conflict is that war seems to be capable of generating whole new political universes, and are able to open windows for major policy shifts. While some wars in the past opened these policy windows, causing individuals to accept levels of taxation in a period of war that would be regarded as intolerable in quieter times, leaders in contemporary wars have shunned war taxes altogether, opting instead for less visible forms of finance, such as borrowing. At issue, then, is why the politics of wartime taxation have changed. The next section outlines the basis for that change, speaking to the source of public willingness to bear the financial burden of war, and the way those attitudes have shaped leaders' strategies toward how they pay for war. The argument in brief: when leaders tax. Just because wars are capable of generating new political universes by raising the public's tolerance for taxation does not mean that they invariably can or do. The Stamp Act of 1765 that King George III levied on the American colonies to pay for the French and Indian Wars became the raison d'etre for the Revolutionary War and American independence. Alexander Hamilton's tax to pay for the 1798 Quasi-War led to the Fry's Rebellion, extinguished by the militia that the Federalists deployed in response. Conclusions about wars opening policy windows derive, in part, from the propensity to focus on large-scale wars. But the modal war, at least for the United States, has not been wars of a large existential nature, but rather smaller-scale wars, such as the War of 1812 or the Afghanistan War, neither of which reached the intensity of a World War II that consumed nearly 50% of GDP at its peak, suggesting that theories of democratic accountability and state-building should register the impact of these more frequent yet smaller military overtures. Taking into account how the broader experience of conflict affects democratic accountability, I first argue that individuals do harbor the sensitivity to war costs that democratic theorists have identified, but that the degree of sensitivity is shaped both by the type of war and underlying state-society relations. The second aspect of the argument is that leaders, seeking to minimize constraints in war, pursue strategies that both anticipate and deflect opposition that would arise from the public's sensitivity. That means they turn to less visible or onerous approaches, such as borrowing rather than imposing war taxes, when individuals express little appetite for fiscal sacrifice in wartime. To elaborate further, the first part of my argument acknowledges that individuals are likely to hold some baseline level of antipathy toward any taxes. The direct effect of taxation on individuals can produce dissatisfaction among the same people whose support is needed for the war and for the leader's political longevity. I identify two main factors that can ease that dissatisfaction. One is engaging in a major war versus a limited war. Large-scale wars create new political universes because they clearly delineate the choice between fiscal sacrifice and total defeat. The trappings of major war, including mobilization, rationing, repurposing civilian industries for military effort, and clear markers of success and failure, help impress upon the public the impact and stakes of the war. By contrast, limited wars are less likely to convey the same palpable stakes, since by definition they have narrower objectives that allow the state's politics, economics, and society to carry on without interruption. Indeed, typical objectives of such wars, goals in Afghanistan for example, included reducing corruption, educating larger percentages of women, and making it easier to obtain a driver's license, are often more likely to resemble foreign aid than military objectives. The more removed those goals are from Americans' sense of security, the less likely Americans are to think that fiscal sacrifice is warranted, as it was in major wars that presented clear and important stakes. Another factor that affects the public's propensity for fiscal sacrifice in wartime is the set of state-society relations underlying the war. a consideration that refers both to the level of taxation and the portfolio of services individuals expect from their government. After World War II, levels of taxation never returned to previous peacetime levels, which has made the public loath to pay specific war taxes, expecting peacetime taxes to be sufficient for both the expanded social welfare state and also for defense. Thus, the post-war politics of taxation has generally favored borrowing over taxation, implying that individuals have had a lower propensity for fiscal sacrifice for the more contemporary wars. How these two factors interact, detailed in Chapter 2, affects the tendency for fiscal sacrifice among the populace. The second part of the argument suggests that these attitudes shape leaders' approaches to war finance. Leaders will favor the revenue approach that mirrors anticipated public attitudes in order to minimize their decision-making constraints. In the context of passing along the costs of war to the public, this means that leaders shy away from war taxes when they know the citizenry has no desire for personal fiscal sacrifice, and they will turn instead to borrowing as a way to shield the public from the costs of war. The costs of borrowing are both diffuse and deferred compared to the direct and immediate impact of taxation. Taken together, the argument visualizes leaders as informed by public attitudes but seeking to avoid opposition, and therefore acting to limit public exposure to the costs of war as a way to minimize constraints on their potential decision-making. That cost sensitivity is not static but conditional on underlying circumstances challenges two sets of alternative arguments about the connection between bearing the costs of war and democratic accountability in war. The first consists of two relatively immutable views of cost sensitivity. Adam Smith observed that leaders looking for ways to generate revenue for war would always find it more convenient to defray this expense by misapplying the sinking fund than by imposing a new tax. Every new tax is immediately felt more or less by the people. It occasions always some murmur and meets with some opposition. Smith's suggestion about the onerous nature of taxation actually led him to advocate taxes as a way to pay for war, as it would close the distance between individuals and the war's burdens. But he nonetheless predicted that exposure to the costs of war through war taxes would have the tendency of offending the people, who by so great and so sudden an increase in taxes would soon be disgusted with the war. The implication is that individuals are naturally cost-sensitive, and bearing the fiscal burden would invariably tarnish their support for war. A contrasting but equally immutable view of the public's relationship with the financial burdens of war suggests that the public is relatively cost-insensitive. To the extent that victory is a function of the resources the state can commit to the war, citizens will be willing to make economic sacrifices during wartime, seeing higher taxes as a vehicle for strengthening the military and increasing the likelihood of winning. Neither the view that individuals are cost-sensitive or cost-insensitive considers the possible variability of cost sensitivity and the circumstances that would give rise to such conditionality. The argument also challenges both bottom-up and top-down views of democratic accountability. The bottom-up view portrays leaders as having hard and fast constraints in the form of public opinion. Instead, my argument gives agency to leaders who can strategically pursue policy instruments that anticipate public opinion consequences and minimize the prospect of political fallout with respect to their tenure or the war. I argue that leaders may both be responsive to public opinion and also seek to reduce the way this opinion constrains their foreign policy options. The need for public consent is exactly what causes leaders to craft their policies in ways that anticipate public attitudes, so as to deflect opposition and prop up support for wars. It similarly challenges the top-down notion that leaders can manufacture public consent through elite discourse, outright deception or lying, or simply through information asymmetries that enable them to sell the public on the use of force, all of which effectively allow leaders to sidestep institutional constraints. The public does find ways to push back against unpopular policies, and leaders have learned to preempt opposition by structuring policies in ways that minimize the constraints that come from dissent. The second part of the argument thereby stakes out a middle ground between those who suggest that leaders are captives of the public's institutional checks and those who believe that leaders can altogether shunt major decisions about war and peace away from the public gaze. Research design. The book examines the argument that public attitudes about fiscal sacrifice depend on the type of war and state society circumstances underlying the war, and that these attitudes have influenced how political elites pay for wars. In developing the argument, I draw on the democratic accountability literature, but focus my theoretical and empirical analysis primarily on the United States. While it is just one state, it is one that subscribes to many institutional characteristics that mark it as a democracy, such as electoral checks and freedom of expression. My empirical evidence, therefore, focuses primarily on the American experience with war, although the last empirical chapter examines cross-national evidence from the United Kingdom and France, with briefer reference to Israel and India, to examine whether similar patterns hold in other democracies that have different types of threats and fiscal traditions. The first part of my empirical strategy involves case studies, which are especially helpful in tracing the argument about changing attitudes towards fiscal burdens of war and the way leaders structure their war finance decisions with those preferences in mind. Each case study briefly discusses the historical background of the war and the form of war finance. The analytical part of the chapter evaluates the source of public attitudes toward war and the degree to which public attitudes affected the turn to taxes or less visible alternatives. To assess public opinion, I probe the public mood, which is defined by the notion that a rather large number out in the country are thinking along certain common lines. While public opinion polls are most helpful in assessing the mood, they are not widely available before World War II. Thus, in addition to polls, I also use other measures: newspaper editorials, individual or collective movements lobbying for a particular policy position, and political conventions that make public declarations in favor of particular policies. As these measures show, there is not always one public mood, but rather different constituencies with different attitudes towards war and war taxes. To interrogate the linkages between those attitudes and war finance strategies, I turn to primary source communications between political elites. I also use congressional hearings and debates on war tax legislation, and secondary source material such as biographies of wartime presidents or diaries of aides to those presidents. Another way of exploring the linkages between public fiscal sacrifice and approaches to wartime finance is through the design of tax legislation itself, since historical evidence may not always point to the effect of public opinion on policy decisions. Of course, an absence of evidence that public opinion weighed on leaders is not evidence of its absence. Indeed, in leaders' conduct of foreign policy, attention to public attitudes is so ingrained in their working habits that it was unnecessary to make constant references to it in historical records. To the extent possible, I access the ways leaders reference the explicit effect of public opinion, but I also analyze congruence between the structure of public opinion and the design of particular policies in a way that, given public attitudes, would generate maximum consent and minimize opposition. The attention to policy design follows the assumptions embedded in arguments about dynamic representation. According to this perspective, elected politicians sense the mood of the moment, assess its trend, and anticipate its consequences. Changes in opinion will lead politicians to revise their beliefs about future election opportunities and hazards. Such strategic adjustment will drive policy through rational anticipation. Leaders perceiving the national mood will bring policy into line with these preferences to minimize the political risk. This means not just electoral risk to their tenure, but in the case of wars, declining consent that is at the root of legitimate conduct of conflict. Particular policy changes then, based on these assumptions, are the effect of perceptible changes in public attitudes. Since leaders may not make explicit reference to the constraining effects of public opinion and how their proposed policies intend to anticipate opposition, I look to the peculiarities of tax legislation itself. to the extent that particular legislation creates winners and losers that map onto the individuals or groups expressing particular preferences on tax legislation. Then we can draw inferences about the connection between the public inputs and policy outcomes. Indeed, in a number of instances, the peculiarities of particular tax legislation were so congruent with public attitudes that alternative explanations are difficult.
Sample complete. Ready to continue?